2.3 million years ago, Africa was a world unlike anything we know today. Vast grasslands stretched toward the horizon, dense forests surrounded ancient rivers, and every sound in the wilderness could mean the difference between life and death. In this dangerous world lived Homo Habilis, one of the earliest members of our human lineage. They were small and vulnerable compared with many of the predators around them. They had no metal weapons, no shelters made from stone, and no modern technology. Their greatest weapons were simple stone tools, sharpened wooden sticks, teamwork, and the instinct to survive. One morning, a small group of Homo habilis moved carefully through tall golden grass near an ancient river. A mother walked close to her young child, while several adults searched the ground for food. Their eyes constantly moved from the trees to the grass and toward the distant water. Then something changed. The birds suddenly became silent. The insects stopped buzzing. Even the wind seemed to disappear. The group froze. One of the males noticed strange marks in the wet soil. They were enormous footprints, far larger than the tracks of any animal they had encountered before. He slowly knelt beside them and touched the fresh mud. The tracks were still wet. Whatever had made them was nearby. The group immediately became nervous. The mother pulled the child closer to her body while the strongest males picked up their primitive wooden spears. Then came a low, terrifying sound from the grass. A huge reptilian head slowly appeared between the vegetation. The creature was enormous. Its body was heavily muscled. Its tail stretched several meters behind it, and powerful claws dug into the earth as it moved forward. It resembled a gigantic ancient monitor lizard, an enormous predator built for hunting. The Homo habilis stared in terror. For a few seconds, neither side moved. The giant reptile lowered its head. One of the males stepped forward and raised his. The giant reptile suddenly lunged forward. The Homo habilis scattered in every direction. A mother grabbed her child and ran toward a group of large rocks, while two males moved in the opposite direction, trying to draw the predator away from the family. The enormous reptile accelerated with surprising speed. Its heavy body crashed through the grass, sending dust and broken stems into the air. One of the males turned and threw a stone. It struck the creature's thick hide. The reptile stopped for a moment and swung its massive head toward him. That was exactly what the humans needed. The male shouted and waved his spear, desperately trying to keep the predator's attention. Behind him, the others escaped toward the rocks. But the creature was not fooled for long. With a violent movement, it charged again. The male ran. His feet slipped on the loose soil, and he fell hard. The giant reptile was only moments away. Then another Homo habilis appeared from the side and hurled a large stone. The impact made the predator turn. A second stone followed, then another. Suddenly, the humans were no longer running blindly. They were working together. Several members of the group began throwing stones while others shouted and waved their wooden weapons. The giant reptile swung its enormous tail. The force of the movement sent dust flying and knocked one of the humans off balance. But the group refused to break apart. The mothers kept the children behind the rocks while the strongest adults formed a loose defensive line. Their primitive weapons were nothing compared with the creature's enormous jaws and claws. But they had something the predator did not. They had each other. The giant reptile charged once more. The humans moved aside at the last moment. The creature crashed into the rocks and briefly lost its balance. One male raised his wooden spear and struck the ground directly in front of the predator, trying to make himself appear larger and more. Evening was approaching, but there was no relief. Although the giant reptile had disappeared into the tall grass, everyone kept looking in the same direction. Whenever the grass moved with the wind, they froze. Every distant sound from the river reminded them that danger was still nearby. One of the male Homo habilis was injured. A deep wound covered his arm, and he struggled to walk. Another member of the group supported him as they moved. But now they faced another problem. They had to leave the river immediately. Staying in the open was too dangerous. If the giant predator returned, there would be nowhere to hide. The group decided to move toward a rocky shelter. The mother kept her child close while two strong males walked ahead, carrying primitive wooden spears and stones. Every step was careful. Suddenly, the grass behind them moved violently. Everyone stopped. For a moment, they thought the terrifying predator had returned. Then a small animal burst from the grass and disappeared into the distance. The group breathed again, but the relief lasted only seconds. A deep sound came from far behind them. Then another. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The most experienced male immediately understood. The predator was following them. There was no time to wait. The entire group began running toward the rocks. The mother carried her child. Two men supported the injured hunter. The others kept looking over their shoulders. Then they saw it. A gigantic head appeared above the tall grass. The prehistoric predator was coming again, and this time it was much closer. It lowered its body and charged forward with incredible speed. The humans ran faster. The rocky shelter was only a short distance away. One male turned, grabbed a heavy stone, and threw it toward the predator. The stone landed directly in front of the enormous reptile. For a moment, the creature stopped. That was the chance they needed. The entire group rushed B. The giant predator suddenly charged. Its enormous body tore through the tall grass as it rushed toward the rocky shelter. The Homo Habilis stood their ground, terrified but determined. The first male threw a heavy stone. Another followed, then another. The stones struck the ground around the predator, forcing it to slow down. The creature opened its massive jaws and swung its powerful tail. One of the men narrowly escaped the strike and fell against a rock. Another immediately pulled him to safety. The group refused to break apart. Several adults shouted and waved their wooden spears while the mothers kept the children hidden deep inside the rocky shelter. The predator moved closer. But then something unexpected happened. The injured male noticed a narrow passage between two large rocks. If the group could reach it, the enormous reptile would not be able to follow them easily. He pointed toward the opening. The others understood. One by one, they began moving backward toward the narrow passage. The predator charged again. At the last possible moment, the humans moved aside. The massive reptile crashed against the rocks. Dust exploded into the air. The group rushed through the narrow opening. The mother pulled her child close and disappeared into the shelter. The adults followed. The giant predator tried to squeeze between the rocks, but its enormous body could not fit through the narrow passage. It hissed angrily. The humans remained silent. For the first time, they realized they had found a place where the creature could not reach them. The predator waited outside. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the ancient African horizon. The giant reptile finally turned away. Its enormous silhouette moved through the grass and gradually vanished into the darkness. Nobody moved until the sound of its footsteps disappeared completely. Inside the shelter, the group gathered together. The injured male was X. The night became completely silent. Inside the rocky shelter, the small fire continued to burn while the Homo Habilis remained close together. No one dared to wander away from the group. Outside, the ancient African wilderness continued its endless struggle for survival. Distant animal calls echoed across the darkness. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere beyond the river, the giant reptile was still somewhere in the night. But the humans had survived. At first light, the group slowly prepared to leave the shelter. The injured male could finally stand. His companions supported him as they walked toward the riverbank. The mother carried her child, while the other adults searched the surrounding area for food. Near the water, they discovered the enormous tracks of the predator. The footprints were fresh. The creature had been there during the night. Everyone stopped. They looked at one another. They knew the danger had not disappeared. But this time, they were no longer helpless. They had learned how to recognize the signs of danger. They had learned to protect their children. And most importantly, they had learned that cooperation could turn a vulnerable group into a powerful force. The group continued moving across the ancient landscape. The rising sun illuminated the golden grass behind them. The rocky shelter slowly disappeared into the distance. For the young child walking beside the mother, the events of the previous day would become only a distant memory. But for the adults, the encounter would remain unforgettable. They had stood before a predator far larger and more powerful than themselves. They had faced fear. They had been chased. They had nearly lost one of their own. And yet, they had survived. Millions of years later, the descendants of creatures like these would eventually build villages, cities, and civilizations. But the story of survival began much earlier. It began with small groups of early humans learning age. The sun climbed higher over the ancient African landscape, but the Homo Habilis group did not forget what had happened. They moved carefully through the woodland, staying close together and avoiding the places where the giant predator might be hiding. Every few steps, one of the adults stopped to examine the ground. A broken branch, a deep footprint, freshly disturbed soil. These small signs had suddenly become extremely important. The group was learning to read the landscape. Near a cluster of trees, they discovered something unexpected. A large animal had recently been killed. The smell of fresh blood filled the air. The humans immediately became cautious. Food was valuable, but approaching a fresh carcass could be extremely dangerous. The oldest male raised his hand, warning everyone to stop. They listened. Then they heard a low growl from behind the trees. Everyone froze. The giant predator had returned. Only its eyes and part of its massive head were visible through the vegetation. The Homo habilis slowly backed away. This time, they did not panic. They remembered the previous encounter. They stayed together. The mothers moved behind the adults. The strongest males lifted their spears. But instead of attacking, they slowly retreated toward open ground. The predator stepped forward. Then another member of the group shouted and threw a stone toward the trees. The reptile turned its head. Another stone followed. The humans continued making noise, creating the impression that there were more of them than there really were. The predator hesitated. It had already discovered that these small creatures were not easy prey. After several tense moments, the giant reptile turned toward the carcass instead. The humans immediately used the opportunity to escape. They moved quickly through the grass until the trees were far behind them. Only then did they stop. For the first time, the group understood something important. They did not all. By late afternoon, the Homo habilis group reached a wide open valley surrounded by rocky hills. The area appeared safer, but the adults remained alert. They had learned that danger could appear without warning. The group stopped beside a cluster of large stones and began searching for edible plants, roots, and small animals. The children stayed close to their mothers. The strongest adults watched the surrounding grass. Then one of the hunters noticed movement on the distant hillside. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow. But the shadow moved. Everyone stopped. A second enormous reptile appeared between the rocks. It was smaller than the predator they had faced before, but still large enough to kill an unprotected human. The group immediately gathered together. The children were moved behind the adults. The hunters raised their wooden spears. But this time, something was different. The humans were prepared. They had already learned from their previous encounter. Instead of running in different directions, they formed a tight defensive circle. The predator slowly approached. It lowered its head. Its powerful tail moved from side to side. The humans shouted together. The sound echoed across the valley. The creature stopped. One of the hunters stepped forward and struck his spear against a rock. Another hunter did the same. Soon, the entire group was making noise. The predator looked from one human to another. It could sense that attacking would be dangerous. For several moments, both sides remained still. Then the reptile suddenly moved forward. The humans stepped backward together. Nobody broke formation. The predator came closer. The hunters raised their spears. But at the last moment, the creature turned away. It disappeared between the rocks. The group remained silent. They had successfully defended themselves without even needing to attack. The mother looked down at her child. The child was still frightened. Night fell across the ancient African valley. The Homo habilis gathered around a small fire inside a shallow rocky shelter. The flames flickered across their tired faces while the darkness stretched beyond the entrance. The children stayed close to their mothers. The adults remained awake. After everything they had experienced, nobody wanted to take the risk of sleeping deeply. One of the hunters sat near the entrance, holding a wooden spear. His eyes constantly searched the darkness. Suddenly, he heard something, a faint movement in the grass. He raised his hand. Everyone became silent. The fire continued to crackle. Then came another sound, a slow scraping noise against the rocks. The hunter leaned forward. Two small eyes appeared beyond the firelight. For a moment, everyone thought the giant predator had returned. The mothers pulled the children closer. The hunters raised their spears. But the animal remained in the darkness. It did not attack. It simply watched. The oldest male slowly threw a burning branch toward the entrance. The flames landed in the grass. The creature immediately moved away. The humans realized something important. Fire frightened some of the animals that hunted them. They had discovered another powerful tool. Not a weapon made from stone, not a spear, but fire itself. The group added more dry branches to the flames. The shelter became brighter. The darkness moved farther away. For the first time, the children began to relax. One young child reached toward the warm light. The mother gently pulled him back. The adults exchanged quiet looks. They understood that the fire could give them warmth, light, and protection. But they also knew it had to be guarded. Outside, the wilderness continued moving. Hyenas called in the distance. Night birds cried from the trees. And somewhere beyond the valley, the giant reptile continued hunting. The Homo Habilis remained together. They had survived because they wa. Morning returned to the ancient African valley. The first rays of sunlight appeared above the rocky hills, slowly turning the grass golden. The Homo Habilis group woke beside the dying fire. For a few moments, everything seemed peaceful, but the adults knew better. The wilderness never stayed peaceful for long. The hunters gathered their wooden spears and stone tools. The mothers checked the children, making sure everyone was safe. Then they began moving toward the river. They needed water. They also needed food. As they traveled, one of the hunters noticed fresh tracks in the soft earth. He crouched down. The footprints were enormous. The same giant reptile had passed through the area during the night. The group immediately became cautious. They changed direction. Instead of approaching the river from the open side, they moved through a narrow path between the rocks. This time, they were using what they had learned. They were planning ahead. After several hours, they reached a quiet section of the river. The water was shallow. The group began drinking. The children played near the edge while the adults watched carefully. Suddenly, a large bird flew from the trees. Everyone looked up. Then the birds began flying away from the river. Something had frightened them. The oldest hunter immediately stood up. He stared toward the tall grass. Nothing moved. Then a long tail slowly appeared. The giant predator had returned. It was watching the humans from the opposite side of the river. The group froze. The mother pulled her child behind her. The hunters formed a defensive line. But this time, nobody panicked. The predator stepped into the water. Its powerful legs pushed through the shallow river. The humans began backing away. The creature continued forward. One hunter raised his spear. Another picked up a large stone. But before anyone could attack, the group noticed something. The river became deeper in the middle. The predator, the Homo Habilis group, continued deeper into the rocky hills, believing they had finally escaped the giant predator. But they did not know that another danger was waiting ahead. The path became narrower. Large rocks surrounded them on both sides, creating a natural passage through the hills. The adults moved slowly. The children stayed in the middle of the group. Suddenly, one of the hunters stopped. He had heard something above them. A small stone rolled down the hillside. Then another. Everyone looked upward. Nothing was visible. But the hunter raised his hand, warning everyone to stay silent. A few seconds later, a huge shadow appeared between the rocks. The giant reptile had followed them. It had found another route through the hills. The group was trapped. There was open ground behind them, steep rocks on both sides, and the enormous predator blocking the path ahead. The mothers pulled the children behind the adults. The hunters tightened their grip on their wooden spears. The predator slowly moved forward. Its claws scraped against the stone. Its enormous jaws opened. The humans began backing away, but there was nowhere to go. Then the oldest hunter noticed something. Above the narrow passage was a large, unstable rock. He looked at the other hunters. They understood. They did not need to defeat the predator directly. They needed to change the environment. The hunters began striking the base of the rock with heavy stones. The first strike did nothing. The second strike loosened a small piece. The predator continued approaching. The group worked faster. Stone after stone hit the rock. A crack appeared. The giant reptile was now only a few steps away. The mothers screamed for the hunters to hurry. One final strike landed. The large rock shifted. For a moment, everything became silent. Then the rock began sliding down the slope. The predator suddenly turned and tried to escape. A massive section of loose stone crashed. The Homo Habilis group finally reached a safer valley beyond the rocky hills. The sun was beginning to set, painting the ancient landscape with warm golden light. Everyone was exhausted. The children were tired. The injured male could barely walk, but they were alive. The group stopped beside a large tree and began preparing a temporary resting place. The adults collected dry branches while others searched for edible roots and fruit. For the first time in many days, the group seemed calm, but the oldest hunter remained alert. He climbed onto a low rock and looked across the valley. Far in the distance, something moved. At first, it looked like a small animal. Then it disappeared behind the grass. He watched carefully. Nothing. He climbed down. Perhaps it had only been the wind. That evening, the group gathered around their small fire. The children played quietly. The mothers shared food. The hunters examined their damaged wooden spears. Some were cracked. Some were broken. The battle with the giant reptile had changed them. Their weapons were simple, but they were learning how to use them more effectively. The oldest hunter picked up a sharp stone. He carefully examined its edge. Then he looked at a piece of wood. An idea began to form. He placed the stone against the wooden shaft and began shaping the tip. Another hunter watched him. Then another. Soon, several members of the group began copying the technique. They were improving their tools. They were not simply surviving one day at a time anymore. They were learning from their experiences. The mother watched the hunters working while holding her child. The child reached toward the sharpened spear. She gently moved his hand away. The adults knew these tools could protect them, but they also knew that the wilderness remained dangerous. Night arrived. The group stayed close to the fire. The stars appeared above the ancient African sky. Then, far beyond the valley at deep, the roar came again. This time, it was much closer. The Homo Habilis group immediately stopped moving. The fire crackled in the darkness while every pair of eyes stared toward the edge of the valley. The giant predator slowly emerged from the shadows. Its massive body moved between the trees, its long tail dragging across the ground. But something had changed. The humans were ready. The hunters stood shoulder to shoulder. Their wooden spears had been sharpened with stone. The mothers kept the children behind them. Nobody ran. The predator moved closer. It expected the humans to scatter, just as they had during their first encounter. But they didn't. The oldest hunter stepped forward. He raised his spear. The others followed. The group shouted together. The sound echoed through the valley. The predator stopped. It lowered its head. For several seconds, neither side moved. Then the giant reptile charged. The humans stepped aside together. The first hunter thrust his spear toward the ground in front of the predator. Another hunter threw a heavy stone. The predator turned sharply, but the humans continued moving as a group. They were not trying to overpower the creature. They were confusing it. One hunter shouted from the left. Another shouted from the right. The predator turned toward one sound, then another. The group kept changing positions. The giant reptile became increasingly agitated. It swung its enormous tail. One hunter jumped backward just in time. Another grabbed him and pulled him away. The predator charged again. This time, the hunters moved toward a narrow rocky area. The mother and children were already behind the rocks. The adults slowly followed. The predator tried to pursue them. but the narrow passage forced it to slow down. The hunters used their spears to keep it at a distance. They did not need to kill it. They only needed to survive. Suddenly, the predator stopped. It looked toward the fire. Then, the following morning, the valley was quiet. For the first time in many days, there were no distant roars, no sudden movements in the grass, and no signs of the giant predator. The Homo Habilis slowly left their shelter. The sun rose over the ancient landscape, revealing the damage left behind by their previous encounters. Broken branches covered the ground. Large footprints crossed the soft soil. Pieces of their primitive spears lay scattered near the rocks. The group stopped and looked at the tracks. They knew the predator had moved away, but they also knew that another predator could appear at any moment. The oldest hunter walked toward the footprints. He followed them for several meters. Then he stopped. The tracks led toward a dense forest. He looked back at the group. They had a decision to make. They could continue following the river toward open grassland, or they could enter the forest, where food might be more plentiful, but danger could be hidden everywhere. After a long moment, the group chose the open grassland. They had learned that visibility could save their lives. The adults walked around the children, keeping them protected in the center. As they crossed the grassland, they noticed something unexpected. A herd of large prehistoric animals was moving in the distance. The Homo Habilis stopped to watch. The animals were enormous compared with them, but they were not attacking. They were simply moving toward water. The humans waited until the herd passed. Then they continued their journey. By midday, they reached a small area filled with edible plants. The mothers gathered roots while the hunters searched for small animals. The children explored nearby rocks. For a short time, the group experienced something rare: peace. But survival was never guaranteed. A sudden scream came from one of the children. Everyone turned. The child had discovered a large reptilian egg hidden beneath the bushes. The adults rushed toward. Night returned to the ancient African wilderness. The Homo Habilis group had found a new resting place high among the rocks, far from the river and dense forest. From this elevated position, they could see the valley below. The adults gathered around a small fire while the children rested beside their mothers. For the first time, the group felt that they had created a safer place. But the oldest hunter knew something important. No place was completely safe. He looked toward the distant valley. The grass was moving. At first, he thought it was only the wind. Then he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the trees. The giant reptile had returned. But this time, the predator did not approach the humans. It remained far below. The creature was hunting something else. The Homo Habilis watched silently. The giant reptile moved through the grass and suddenly attacked a smaller animal. The humans witnessed the power of the predator from a safe distance. Its massive jaws closed around its prey. The group remained completely silent. The children watched with fear. The mothers covered their eyes. The oldest hunter understood the lesson. The predator was not evil. It was simply surviving, just like them. Every creature in this ancient world was fighting for food, water, shelter, and survival. The humans were only one part of that enormous struggle. After the predator finished feeding, it moved toward the river. The humans waited. They did not follow. They did not attack. They simply observed. This was another lesson. Sometimes the safest weapon was patience. Hours passed. The predator disappeared into the darkness. The group remained on the rocky ridge. The fire slowly burned lower. Above them, thousands of stars filled the ancient sky. The youngest child woke and looked upward. The mother held him close. She looked toward the stars, then toward the sleeping members of her group. They had survived another day, but their journey was Dawn slowly spread across the ancient African valley. The Homo Habilis group woke beside the fading embers of their fire. For several moments, nobody moved. They listened. No road, no movement in the grass, no sound from the river. The giant predator was gone. The oldest hunter stood and looked across the horizon. The group had survived, but their journey was not finished. They gathered their few belongings and began walking toward a distant valley where water and food might be easier to find. The mother carried her child for part of the journey, while the older children walked beside the adults. The injured hunter, once too weak to walk, was now moving on his own. The group had protected him when he was helpless. Now he was strong enough to continue with them. As they crossed the open grassland, they reached the top of a small hill. Everyone stopped. Below them was a wide river surrounded by green vegetation. It was a promising place. There was water. There were edible plants. And there were rocky areas where they could find shelter. But there was also danger. Fresh tracks covered the muddy riverbank. Some belonged to small animals. Others belonged to enormous reptiles. The group immediately became cautious. The oldest hunter examined the tracks. Then he pointed toward a rocky area farther from the river. They would build their temporary shelter there. The group moved carefully. For the rest of the day, they collected branches, stones, and dry grass. They created a simple protected area between the rocks. It was not a house. It was not a permanent home. But it gave them something incredibly valuable. A place to rest. A place where the children could sleep. A place where the adults could watch the surrounding landscape. As evening approached, they started another small fire. The flames illuminated their faces. The mother sat beside her child. The injured hunter sat nearby. The oldest hunter watched the sunset. He remembered,